Hey guys, it's Mrs. Bollinger. We're doing part two of the Gilded Age. Last time we got to talk about the rise in businesses and some of the business owners and leaders during the time period. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into that and some changes that happened during the Gilded Age as well. So first off, this is the first time we have the introduction of corporations and also of trusts. So what a trust is a trust is a bunch of separate companies that are based under the control of one single managing board. And the trusts were important during that time period because that's how the smaller businesses became very large businesses. The reason these are talked about a lot during this time period is because this is the first time this has happened. Most of the time before this, businesses stayed pretty small. And it also rose to the point of trusts becoming monopolies. Once that managing board had the control of many of the smaller companies, they would start controlling the market. And what a monopoly does is it basically takes control of one service or one product and controls that entire product or service for the entire country. And that's not good for capitalism. The reason it's not good for capitalism is because capitalism thrives on competition. And with a trust or a monopoly, you don't have any competition. There's one company that controls everything. And it's just not good for competition at all because they're controlling everything. So let's take, for example, railroads. If there was one company that controlled the entire railroad network, you couldn't go to another company to buy a railroad ticket if you're moving from place to place, or if you were if you had a business that was moving products from place to place, you basically had to pay whatever price that one particular company wanted. Because if you didn't get your stuff moved, or you didn't get moved from place to place. There was no transportation if you weren't willing to pay their price. So they could inflate the prices, which means increase. They could increase or inflate their prices to whatever they wanted because they were the only company offering that service or that product. It's not good for capitalism whatsoever. And the people that practiced these were called robber barons because these business leaders basically stole money from the poor and the people that were trying to do better, and they didn't really do anything to help them. This whole time period, here, a couple examples of some examples of maybe some trusts today. You see some of these big companies and see how they control a lot of the smaller industries there. And you also have these big news corporations that are all under one particular headline, like Walt Disney owns ABC and ESPN and all of those. It's interesting to see how trusts have started to grow again. They're actually illegal now. They made, we'll talk about in a second, the Sherman Antitrust Act. So they're actually illegal, but industry is kind of moving towards trust again today, which is not good. We need competition for capitalism to work. All right, one of the biggest trusts during that time was Standard Oil. Rockefeller, remember, was the guy who got rich off the refining process of oil. And he had basically the largest corporation in the world at the time. So he goes in with the oil industry. He has about 91% of the oil industry. So if you needed oil, guess who you had to buy from? Rockefeller. So if you needed oil for your factory, if you needed oil for your car, if you needed oil for your train, whatever it is, you had to go to Rockefeller. So Rockefeller could set whatever price he wanted for that oil and made a lot of money off that. So the government files suit against Rockefeller. And they basically say that this is not okay, that he was controlling the industry. He was being unfair in his business practices. He would buy out small companies, or if there was a company that he was trying to buy out, he would lower his prices. So the other company had higher prices, so everybody would buy from him for a while. And then this company would start hurting financially because everybody was buying from him. Well, as soon as this company started hurting financially, he'd be like, hey, I'll offer you some money to buy your business. And they're like, well, we're not doing too well. Okay, sounds good. Sell to Rockefeller. As soon as Rockefeller bought out that business, guess what he does? Increase the price. So now he can control more of the industry. He was ruthless in his ability to monopolize the oil industry. So the Justice Department sued him and said, that's not okay. It's not good for competition. Let's break it up into smaller companies, and because we need competition between the companies for the price to be at a fair price for the economy. The Justice Department amazingly wins, and Standard Oil, if you see here, was split into 34 separate companies, and those companies have evolved into some of the things that we see today, like Exxon and Chevron and BP. All of those companies their roots go back to Rockefeller and what he started with Standard Oil. But this is the time period where we have those rise of trusts, and then the government finally stepping in and saying, can't have that anymore. So that was a huge change from what we call laissez-faire economy. So let's talk about laissez-faire economy, because that's what the government did before the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that ability to make trusts illegal. They basically said, because of this idea of Darwinism, you should have known that from science. Darwin believed in the survival of the fittest in the animal species. Well, people started taking that idea of survival of the fittest and putting it on humans too. So the only companies that should survive are those that are the fittest. So that means they have this laissez-faire idea of government, which means hands off. The government's not gonna touch business. Business, go and do what you need to do to make your money, improve the economy, do well. And we followed that up until the early 1900s, until the Sherman Antitrust Act. Rockefeller is one of the first companies. They start breaking up into smaller companies. And they really felt like they shouldn't touch them until they realized these large corporations were not good for American business. And that was a huge change in the Gilded Age, going from allowing large corporations, large trusts in our society, to disallowing it and having to break up those trusts into smaller companies. So businesses became more regulated. Now, they're regulated all the time, but this was the beginning of that. One of the guys, Carnegie, that made a lot of money during this time period, really did believe of what he called the gospel of wealth. He wrote a book, here's the book right here, wrote a book about it, and saying, back to that Darwin theory, the fittest citizens are the ones that are going to do well in industry, which I don't know that I agree with. There's always different factors in people that survive in industries and certain people that don't make it. But because those people are the fittest, they should also give to those that are less fortunate. And that is one of the positives that comes out of these big businesses. So those people that they called robber barons, they also somewhat called them captains of industry. Because they made all of this money, all of this wealth. If you compare these men that we're studying here, Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, they were worth more money if you look at inflation. And now, like in today's dollars, they're worth more money than Bill Gates and Bezos and all of those people. So these guys were like, they had so much wealth. And Carnegie felt like, because we're the fittest, we should help those that are less fortunate. And one of his big things was building libraries. There's some examples of libraries he built. He also built Carnegie Hall, which I talked about last time. So some of these men did give back and into society and create things for those that were less fortunate too. So you had this balance. Were they robber barons? They certainly had some ruthless business practices, or were they captains of industry helping people rise up and get better at themselves? All right, so some of the things that the government created during this time was Interstate Commerce Commission. They made this to oversee the railroads. Basically, this is the first time the government starts monitoring a business. Now, government is all up in business and monitoring and finding people. I mean, just look at what we're going through today with coronavirus. If a non-essential business, runs right now, they're going to get a fine from the government. That's government oversight. But this is the first time that happens with the Interstate Commerce Commission. We also have, like I was talking about, the Sherman Antitrust Act. It basically outlawed that combination of companies coming together. So they basically said, if you are going to have a bunch of companies together, you can't oversee it all. They have to be separated so that there's competition, because we don't want any monopolies in capitalism, because it doesn't work. All right, moving on. So what were the conditions like for the workers? Now, we talked about these industrialists and these businessmen and what they did and how wealthy they got. Well, what about the people that worked for them? Honestly, it was bad. It was really, really bad. You had people that were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, sometimes even more. So if you're thinking 12 hours a day, that means if you go in at 8 a.m., you're not getting off until 8 p.m. You're working all day long. And really no time for downtime, no time for, socialization, for religious things. I mean, pretty much nothing. You're working your whole life and for very, very little money. The wages were terrible. A lot of the factories that employed the immigrants and people that needed the money just didn't pay very well. So even though you were working all day, every day, you lived in very poor living conditions, and oftentimes didn't have enough money for food and stuff too. So it was not very good for those that were working for these industrialists. I see there that steel mills sometimes demanded 7 days a week, so you didn't even get a day off. They didn't have vacations. There was no vacation time. You worked 6 days a week, all year long. You couldn't apply for vacation. They didn't have sick leave. If you got sick, you didn't get paid. If you don't know what sick leave is if your employer should offer you so many days of sick leave. So if you get a cold or a flu, you can take the day off, still get paid, and not have to go and infect other people. But they didn't have that back then. If you were sick, then you didn't work and you didn't get paid, which was detrimental to your family. There was no unemployment compensation. There was no you lose your job, the government will help take care of you for a while until you find a new one. No, there was none of that. There's no workers' compensations. If you got injured on the job, so you went to work and you were working in a factory with this dangerous equipment, and all of a sudden your arm got chopped off and you couldn't work anymore, the business was like, kick you out. Sorry, see you later. You can't do the job that we hired you for, and you're stuck out on the streets. What do you do? That's why a lot of these things start changing after the Gilded Age, because they realize how much the businesses were just terrible to the workers and didn't protect workers' rights whatsoever. Child labor was a serious problem. Kids as young as 5 years old. I have a 5-year-old. I can't imagine sending her to work for 12 hours a day, sometimes 14. And they only made, the younger kids only made 10 to 20% of what an adult would make. They weren't doing the exact same work, of course, but just the percentages are just insanely low. So that was a really bad part of the working conditions during that time period. So because of all these issues with the working conditions, we see the rise of labor unions. This is when labor unions are created. Basically said, what happens is if the workers unite and they all come together and say, we're not going to work until you change the working conditions, then the company can't make any money, right? Simple way. So like okay, let's take for example a t-shirt factory. Okay, they're making t-shirts. They have 100 employees making, I don't know, 10,000 t-shirts a day. If those 100 employees come to work one day, but they don't enter the building, they stand outside and what they call strike. They basically say, we're not going to work until you change XYZ. Maybe it's they wanted shorter working hours. Maybe they wanted better pay. Maybe they wanted some vacation time or some sick leave or whatever it is that they were striking for. They basically said, we're not working until you fix this. And it kind of forced the company into seeing what the workers wanted and trying to change things for the workers. Strikes worked fairly well until you found like people that would work anyway. So like if that company of 100 people were making 10,000 t-shirts a day and that t-shirt company was able to sell all 10,000 shirts a day, then all of a sudden their workers aren't working. The company's not making any money. And that's why they're really pressured into, meeting their workers' demands, because if those 10,000 shirts a day aren't being made, the company's not making any profit. So it behooves the company to go in and try to make sure that the workers are getting what they deserve. Not always. It didn't always work. We'll talk about some problems here in a second. The Knights of Labor was one of the first unions. They accepted all workers, race and gender. That didn't always happen either. They are the first that pushed for an 8-hour workday instead of 12 hours so people could have downtime. Equal pay for women. Shoot, we're still trying to fight for that one. And they took both skilled and unskilled workers into their labor union. Another labor union was the American Federation of Labor, headed by Samuel Gompers. His focus was white males. Well, unfortunately, females were not in that, nor were minorities, but they really wanted higher wages and shorter work weeks. So instead of working 6 days a week, maybe work 5, which is what we have now. So Samuel Gompers really helped with the American Federation of Labor. But like I said, labor unions didn't always work out. There was a huge railroad strike in 1877 where the railroad workers went on strike, and basically nobody could move products from one place to another. Like transportation just kind of went to a halt. Well, the president at the time, Hayes, actually had to send in federal troops to stop the strike. So the workers didn't get what they wanted in that particular situation because nobody was getting the products they needed. They needed the trains to be running. So that was federal oversight there. You also have scabs, what they call, it's a kind of a derogatory term for workers that would basically walk past the strike lines and still go into the building and work. They were replacement employees basically for those that were striking. And oftentimes if the strike went to court, the courts would side with the business and not with the workers. It took a long time for labor unions to really get the successes that they wanted. There was another one called the Haymarket Riot Strike. A lot of people were demonstrating and protesting against labor conditions, and police came and threw a bomb. Not the best decision there. Pretty scary for that time period for sure. So people died because of it, and a lot of other people that weren't in a union blamed the unions. These radical crazy people getting bombs thrown at them and kind of gave them a bad rep. We had the Homestead Streak against Carnegie, and that didn't go well. Carnegie did not like labor unions at all. So he basically punished anyone who was a part of that union strike. Another railroad industry strike, that they stopped working again and again when railroads weren't moving, then products weren't moving, and so the federal government has to step in again and try to prevent that. It was just little things, one after another, that labor unions tried to get better rights for workers, and you know, there were a lot of setbacks along the way. Now, these companies a lot of times were able to exploit their workers because of the amount of immigrants that were coming into America. Between 1870 and 1920, we have 20 million Europeans moving here into America. So they definitely have an increase of the amount of people wanting work. And so these companies were able to exploit their workers, because if you didn't like the working conditions, or if you didn't like the amount you were getting paid, okay, we'll fire you and just hire the next guy that's standing on the street wanting a job. Because they were able to replace you so easily, the exploitation was quite great during that time period. So just to make sure we understand, labor unions were formed to help workers' rights, to protect workers' rights. Some of the problems labor unions had were the federal government stepping in, going against strikes, and also the court system not working with the labor unions, and a lot of problems where the police and other parts of society looked down on labor unions and what they were doing. So with the immigrants, we have a huge movement called nativism, hopefully I said that right, nativism. And that basically was kind of, Americans are better than immigrants. Like, if you're born here in America, you're of a higher class than somebody that is immigrating into America. And you have a lot of hatred towards immigrants during this time period because they view immigrants as taking Americans' jobs. Sound familiar? Still see that today. It's not gone away, actually, in over 100 years. A lot of immigration issues that we have today are still back of, well, immigrants are taking American jobs. So it wasn't not something that's foreign to us at all. But people really did believe that Americans were better than immigrants, and they shouldn't get the same rights that they have here in America. They definitely looked down upon them. Here's a good political cartoon to kind of see the differences in immigrants and businessmen, and saying, hey, wait a minute, so here's the guy here, and he's an American, and he's not able to work. And the businessman over here is just taking all these immigrants off the boat, saying, come and work for me. This poor American guy here, he's just, you know, destitute and can't feed his family and all that. So this idea of nativism was very prevalent in society, even posting political cartoons in newspapers and stuff about it. All right, the two islands that most immigrants came through, if you have heard of Ellis Island before, it's in New York Harbor. There was millions of immigrants that flowed through Ellis Island's process system. They would check for like infectious disease, like if you had a fever, or if your eyes were red, or if you had a cough or something like that, you were quarantined before you were able to come into the city. And they, you know, checked from where you were. They kept trying to keep records of where people were from and where you were going and that kind of stuff. And in San Francisco, there was another island that a lot of the Asians entered through, a lot of Chinese immigrants, and that was called Angel Island. And basically the same thing, that they would check for all of these things before they let you into the country. But they pretty much allowed during this time period just about anybody who wanted to move here to move and, you know, start a new life. There was a lot of culture shock coming from other countries to America. And there was also this idea that America started becoming a melting pot. There was no just one specific type of American. You know, Americans became a mixture of people from many different countries, and especially during this time period, because people were coming literally from all over the world to America to, you know, pursue that American dream of starting a new life, starting over, and many succeeded, so that was good as well. One unfortunate group during this time period that was really discriminated against for immigration were Chinese immigrants. So they had laws passed that basically said, we're not accepting any more Chinese. They had those laws for many years, and Japan too, a lot of Asian immigrants, they didn't want people coming here from Asia. And a lot of it has to do with racism and the idea that they were an inferior race to Caucasians and white people. And not right, not okay. Another hard time in our history. But they definitely were not always accepting of all of the people that wanted to move here to America. Here's an example of a picture put in the paper of how Chinese immigrants lived versus Americans and how they lived. You know, not very good working conditions or living conditions at all. Here's another one. It says the Temple of Liberty, passport to the USA. And they basically were accepting everyone except the Chinese. You see how the Chinese is stopped there saying you're not allowed to come into the country. All right, so with all these 20 million people coming into America, I mean, just unfathomable the numbers of people that were coming off the boats every day. You also have a growth of cities. Cities boomed during this time period. Populations increased so rapidly, it was really hard to keep up. But the main reasons these cities grew so quickly, especially in the Northeast and the West Coast. Those were the two main areas. And that's still true today. The major populations in our country, Northeast and West Coast, California, New York, Boston, all of those areas. Chicago kind of is one of the exceptions. It's away from the East Coast, but it was still a very growing city during this time. Businesses, they went to industrialization, so they needed more workers. So they needed the workers, and they needed cheap labor, which the immigrants did provide. The immigrants came for that work. They came for jobs, and they were willing to be paid at a very cheap rate. They also have some problems in farming, because farming went from being a very labor-intensive job to more in the industrial era, more and more machines taking over the jobs of the farmers. So these farmers are being displaced and moving out of the farms and out of the rural areas to the city to find work, because they're no longer needed on the farms. The machines are basically taking over and taking their jobs. This is also one of the time periods after, remember I said we were looking at Reconstruction. After Reconstruction ends, we start to see a migration of some of the African Americans in the South to the North. They wanted to get away from the segregation. They wanted to get away from the discrimination in the South. So they start moving to these northern cities to find jobs too. So urbanization, or growth of cities, booms during this area. But that doesn't come without its problems. There was a huge housing shortage. Where do you house all these people? Skyscrapers are being invented, so they start rising instead of going out. So they're able to fit more people in a smaller amount of land. But as they're building these skyscrapers, they're not building apartments like we know today. A lot of the what they call tenement housing was a huge amount of people in a small amount of space. Like you wouldn't have your own bathroom, you wouldn't have your own running water, you would have common areas for those. And so your apartment was just a big room, and you fit as many people in there as possible. You see some pictures here of some of the crowded living conditions in these places. It was just terrible. And one of the things you get when you get people all close together with poor sanitation is disease. I mean, diseases ran rapid through these immigrant populations, and it was just not very good living conditions whatsoever. Safety was a big concern as well. They start creating fire escapes during this time because we have a huge amount of fires where people just died because they couldn't get out of the building. You know, if you're on the 10th floor of a skyscraper and there's no fire escape and the building starts burning, what do you do? Like, you're gonna die if you try to get out of the building because it's on fire. So they start building fire escapes and stuff like that to try to help in some of this for these problems. Transportation was a huge struggle, trying to get people from, you know, work to where they lived and all of that. They just couldn't keep up with the growth. And the more and more people you add to a small amount of space, everybody needs water. How are you going to get them clean water? That was difficult to get to them. And everybody also makes waste, and they make, you know, garbage. So what do you do with that? Like, how do you keep the city clean? How do you keep disease from running rampant? And of course, any place where you have a bunch of people in a small amount of area, you're going to have increased crime. You're going to have people that are going to steal and try to take things that aren't theirs. So a lot of issues and a lot of problems with this urbanization, and things aren't fantastic for sure. And because of that, we get some help from people that try to change things. So they see these conditions, they see the problems in society, they see the poor living conditions, they see the issues with immigrants not being accepted, and they start creating what they call settlement houses. Settlement houses basically came together as a community center where people would come and get services. So maybe there was a doctor there or a nurse that would help with sicknesses and illnesses. There could be a teacher there to help teach young ones how to read. There could be people there to show, like, how to get a job. Like, if you were just off the boat, you could go to one of these settlement houses and try to get a job quicker. The whole house was one of the most popular. It was in 1889. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr started that. Very amazing philanthropists, and being able to give back what they had to society. And they also have the social gospel movement, where people, you know, seek reform in the name of Jesus, trying to fix the problems in society. We're going to do another lesson on progressivism and how they tried to fix all these problems. But for now, I just wanted to see that the growth of industry brought more immigrants, brought more people, which brought more problems. And life is not fantastic during this time, for sure. A lot of the focus on this is in those big cities and not in the rural areas like the South. The South was still kind of just doing its thing with growing crops, and you've got the sharecropping and selling cotton and all of that, much more rural farm-based areas. But these are focused on the big cities and what it was like for them. Hopefully you've learned a lot and able to answer your questions on the Gilded Age Part 2, and you'll have a great assignment looking at Robert Barons versus Captains of Industry, these people that created these governments. All right, thanks so much. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will talk to you guys later.